I wanted to give a big welcome to those of you in the audience. I know this is the last day of the festival, and we've just news about how many people have been tuning in globally. So it's really exciting to be here and chatting with all of you. The format today is we're going to have each of our amazing presenters talk a little bit about their work, and then we're going to have a discussion, and then we're going to move into Q&A with the audience. So I'm hoping that it's going to be fun and engaging for everybody. And we're monitoring the chat, so as you guys have questions, I think we're also happy to take questions sort of in the middle as things come up. So this is a research roundtable focused on the topic of raising good gamers. This is an initiative that Susanna Pollock from Games for Change and I launched on Tuesday, sort of officially in the world. It's an initiative really to, it's a cross-sector initiative looking at ways of making more fair, inclusive online gaming spaces for kids. I'm personally on a mission to make the internet more kid-friendly, and research is a big lever in that. So I asked all of these wonderful women here today who come to us from a range of disciplines and have been looking at issues of play, of learning, of health, of wellness, of adolescent development, of race, of gender, in the context of games, ethics, design. And so I'm hoping what's going to come out of the conversation today is just some kind of thinking and maybe some new information about the kinds of things researchers, UX designers are thinking about when they're designing spaces, play spaces for kids, particularly online play spaces. So I'm hoping to, we're going to start with Kishonna, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about your research.
Yep. Absolutely. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. I am, so I'm Kishonna Gray. Thank you all for having me. I'll share some slides. So if folks want to tune into those slides, you can see those there. So I'm Kishonna Gray. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago in communication and gender and women's studies. I'm so glad to be a part of this. And I thank you, Katie, for inviting me to join and to be a part of this. Here's a slide that shows, where my research, specifically connects to the Raising Good Gamers initiative. I'm focused specifically on enriching esports, digital equity, and learning through designing and making. So I'll talk a little bit about, like the broader project, and I'm trying to do this in 5 minutes. And Katie, just signal me.
Oh yeah, you have a little bit more than 5 minutes. So yep.
Okay.
Take your time. You're good.
So this is just a snippet of a larger project that I'm focusing on. But I think broadly, the topic is like youth and hybrid digital infrastructures, technosocial models rooted in communal design. And really, that's just a fancy way of saying, hey, when kids don't have access to internet and to technology and to different kinds of spaces, what then do they do? Because they still participate and they find ways to still participate. So here are some of my guiding questions. It's so how do geographically isolated youth utilize publicly available tools and technologies to develop hybrid networks across communities? How have these hybrid networks influenced and developed the creation of culturally sustaining spaces? How do the culturally sustaining spaces impact how youth develop computational maker practices? What are the everyday activities informing youth's computational thinking and making practices? And across the different sites that I'll talk to you about specifically in the Chicago context, what are the design principles influencing prolonged engagement with the culturally sustaining computational maker spaces? Now, those are, a lot of like fancy words, but I promise it's really, easy and simple and really accessible. So just a little bit about the larger project. So what I'm going to talk to you specifically is focusing on Chicago's South Side, specifically the neighborhood of Englewood. But a lot of this work, was I've generated a lot of information like from my previous work in Appalachia. There are several counties in Eastern Kentucky where I focus on mostly socioeconomically disadvantaged white youth and Black youth and migrant farm worker youth. Also, in my time in Arizona, this project, I focus on like Yaqui indigenous youth, Mexican and Mexican American youth in Guadalupe, Arizona. That's like a town inside Phoenix, Arizona, for those of you who are familiar with Phoenix. And I've also like developed and expanded this, to focus on like youth in the favelas of Brazil. So David Namer, he invited me to be a part of that. Also, I have a friend, Gabriella Richard, who's at Penn State. And so she focuses a lot of this. And so we're expanding, a lot of what we're doing, like to focus on youth in rural Pennsylvania as well. So specifically, just to talk about, what I'm looking at right now, I think my interest in this project was really to just explore the different pathways to adopting gaming technologies for youth in particular. I think, in traditional models, there was a traditional pathway like for like PC gaming and traditional models around console gaming, right? So, but that's different now. We're seeing like a growing reliance, like specifically on mobile devices, and with that, we're also seeing like this growing reliance on public Wi-Fi and publicly available Wi-Fi. And there's also, we often, don't talk about like space and place when we're talking about like things related to like the digital or internet, but there's also, especially for these geographically isolated youth, there's a reliance on public spaces to sustain these practices. And especially for like a lot of the Black and brown youth in particular, these spaces also have to be safe and they have to be accessible, especially for instance, like if, Black youth are traveling to different parts of the city in Chicago, there's some neighborhoods where, police might be called on them. I'm thinking about even like with the Yaqui and the Mexican youth that are in Guadalupe, there have been particularly like ICE raids in their neighborhoods where even them playing in their own spaces, because they're in these brown bodies, they're not safe to just be in these areas. And I think the game of Pokemon Go really highlighted like a lot of these disparities, like in particular ways, right? And so I think that's the jumping off part, for this particular project. So here's I'm going to show why Chicago, right? Here's a map. Hopefully everybody can see this on their screen. So on the right side, there's a map of a neighborhood called South Loop, or it's the museum campus. So it's a largely white, affluent area, and it's also adjacent to like the museum campus. So if you come to Chicago, a lot of folks go, to like these areas. And here's like the map of Englewood. And right now, this is the only Pokemon Go stops like in the neighborhood of Englewood. I want to highlight also these other few maps here. So here is that Englewood Pokemon Go map. And so, but there are also these two maps. The one on the left, that's like the, Chicago prides itself in being a very accessible city with a lot of like hot spots, right? So when you look at this map though, like on the north side of the city, there's a whole lot of those blue areas. I'm not sure if y'all can see my arrow, but I'm pointing to like that little blue dot there. This little blue dot, that's like the only available, public hotspot in this neighborhood, that I'm focusing on. So what is happening is that a lot of these youth in particular, and of course the people in the neighborhood in general, are relying on the public libraries actually for a lot of their needs and for connectivity. So if you see that the red dots here, these are the locations of the Chicago public libraries that are in that neighborhood. And so what I found in a project that I started last summer, I noticed that a lot of youth, who didn't have internet at home, they did have these mobile devices, they had phones, but they needed to connect to Wi-Fi. So a lot of them would go to the public libraries for their connectivity. Am I okay on time?
Yeah, you're doing great.
Okay, fantastic. So what we found, whenever Pokemon Go was like happening, and we were doing like this project, all the youth said they wanted to play Pokemon Go, and they said they were essentially pushed out of different parts of the city of Chicago, because there were like groups of Black kids, mean something, for a lot of people, like, and for the city of Chicago, that implication is dangerousness, that these kids are dangerous and they need to be purged from these areas. And so they're isolated, they're rooted like just in their neighborhood. So, as the map showed, they don't have these stops. So what we found out, through the Niantic website, the folks that make, Pokemon Go, was that if you wanted a Pokestop, there had to be like an area of like some cultural significance. The area, it needed to be like a historical marker. And, unfortunately, there, from what the site said at that time, whenever we were trying to get some locations like registered, they said, these areas just weren't significant and these areas weren't safe. That's what they said, right? So in the partnership that I'm developing, particular, I have, here we go. So in connecting, of course, with the universities in the area, with U Media Chicago Public Libraries, we also connected, we're connecting with this community group, Mothers and Men Against Senseless Killing. And so a lot of these folks, they put their physical bodies on a lot of like the corners in the neighborhoods, just so that, kids can like safely pass, like, go to the corner store or travel to like the library, because there are, there is some real violence, not just from police violence, but also like intercultural violence and gang violence is still happening like in their neighborhood. So mass desk has been a very, very influential part of like these kids being able to just like walk around and go from their house to like the library and to meet up and play like in playgrounds. So these women, have really provided, a lot of the protection. So I think that it's very interesting that they are a part of like this infrastructure, because the infrastructure wouldn't exist if these folks weren't providing like the safety for these kids to travel. So I think that they're a very significant part. But I'll get to the point of like what we're actually doing and what stage we are. Unfortunately, COVID has put like a halt on a lot of these plans. But if things were perfect in the world, we would be developing specifically these AR and these VR technologies, having like intentional design. So the partnership that we're building, we're relying like on this, publicly available and accessible like tools, either from Wiki2, there's a listing of them here, even Snapchat. We want it to be accessible. We don't want it to be like this very significant programming. We want to make sure that we're using these everyday tools that these kids are amazing and fascinating with. But what we're doing, we are connecting the youth with these archives, so they can like explore the history of their neighborhoods. So one of the youth last year found out that the corner where the corner store that they often go to was actually the site of like the first the Sears Roebuck store that was in the city of Chicago. And so those are like the different kinds of like activities that we want to do. So if a person downloaded their that AR, the app, that they could see this amazing information that the youth have created and generated to like recreate these beautiful narratives that are in their neighborhoods, that they can get that pride back into their neighborhoods. And so ultimately the kids want Pokemon Go stops, right? That's what they said. But I think they have also found out that they come from beautiful and rich cultures and history. And so I'm kind of framing this as like a techno humanities or a digital humanities kind of project, where it blends the historical elements with the techno innovations that these youth are engaging in. So I'll go ahead and stop there. I think that's the bulk of the project. That's okay. Where we're working on. And again, like I said, I'm very much influenced by the Raising Good Gamers initiative, and I'm glad to be a part of it. And I hope to continue to build these projects with all of everything in mind, especially what Katie and Susan have afforded.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Kishonna. Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting to me is that we often talk about the sort of online safety of young people, right? But there isn't a lot of consideration given to their physical safety. Right. And so that's really, it's like a very interesting dimension to bring to this work, to think about, and also from a policy perspective, right? There's all, I think maybe Celia, you could talk a little bit about cognitive bias a little bit later, kind of bring that in. But there is this, certainly in the designs of kinds of games, in terms of who is being included, who is being excluded, and all of the kind of ways that we think about that. So I think your work really brings this sort of physical component to it, which is super interesting to think about, because we talk about trying to ensure safe online playgrounds for kids, but they also need to be safe in the offline world in order to have safety online. So that's, it's really important work, Kishonna, so I'm really happy. Kishonna's on the advisory board for Raising Good Gamers, so we're really happy to have you. Okay, I'm sorry, we're just gonna like speed through this, but Katie Davis, we'd love to hear from you now about your work.
Hi, everyone. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I will share my screen, and hopefully, and you'll tell me if that's working or not. Okay. So hopefully, I don't hear anything, so I assume it's okay. You can see it. So my name is Katie Davis. I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington in the Information School. And my work focuses, my background is in human development and education. So I have a strong social science background, but because I am in the information school, a lot of my work is influenced by the human-computer interaction researchers around me. So I think a lot about the implications of the research I do around what teens are doing with technology for design, and how we can use empirical insights to design better networked environments for youth, and whether that's gaming or other spaces. And actually, what I'm going to do today is talk about a project that is not related to gaming. Well, it's sort of tangential, I guess, to gaming, but I think that the work itself has some important applications to the initiative of Raising Good Gamers. So this is actually my work related to fan fiction, and with Celia Aragon, who is a computer scientist, we, for I guess the last 5 or 6 years, with our students, we've been exploring what young people are doing in online fan fiction communities, and particularly asking what kinds of mentoring do we see there in online fan fiction communities. And what we did, I guess this started back in 2013, we did a 9-month participant observation of 2 online fan fiction communities. One was fanfiction.net, and then the other one was specific femfiction.net, which is dedicated to My Little Pony. And when I first started this work, I remembered My Little Pony from when I was young. But since I've started, I've had my own child, a son who's 3.5 and obsessed with My Little Pony. So it's been interesting watching him become a fan in his way. Not fan fiction yet, because he can't read or write. But anyway, so we really immersed ourselves in these environments to understand why it is that so many young people, and really people of all ages, but we were more focused on youth, why it is that they're spending so much time and so passionate about writing and reading and providing feedback on fan fiction. What's the magic there? So, and a lot of the students who we worked with were themselves very into fan fiction writing, and actually Celia writes fan fiction herself. So we were very immersed for a long time. We conducted in-depth interviews with young fan fiction authors, and then we took a look at the kinds of reviews that authors get on their stories that they post on these communities, to understand what sort of support they get and what sort of feedback and how they're using it. And out of all of this work, we came up with this idea of how exactly mentoring is working in these online spaces that are dedicated to fan fiction, but I think that the idea fits pretty well in other spaces as well, including gaming spaces. So we presented this idea of distributed mentoring, and it's based on Edwin Hutchins's theory of distributed cognition. And we have identified 7 different aspects, dimensions of distributed mentoring that are uniquely supported by network technology. So really, distributed mentoring happens because of and is facilitated by network technology. So starting at the top and working our way around clockwise, I'll just briefly touch on each one, but aggregation really represents the ability of authors to seek and receive guidance on their writing from many different sources. So they might get feedback from story reviews, from discussion forum posts, or even private messaging between fan fiction authors and readers. And through the process of aggregating these little bits and disparate types of feedback, an overarching direction for the work emerges that is more useful and profound than any one mentoring exchange on its own. Abundance describes just the sheer volume of feedback accessible to the authors. Asynchronous communication in fan fiction communities means that authors and reviewers can interact with each other across time and geographic boundaries. So that really enables collaboration in instances when synchronous interaction would be impossible. Availability relates to the persistent and public nature of reviews, which facilitates sustained exchanges and relationships among community members. The accretion of advice occurs as reviewers interact with each other through comments on individual stories and informed discussions. And so they're referring to and they're building on earlier comments and reviews. Acceleration really refers to the rich discussions generated around disagreements or just areas of lively discussion, I guess, among reviewers about the direction that a particular story should go. And usually that discussion serves to accelerate the process of learning through active discussion. And then finally, and probably most importantly, is affect. Authors really told us about the emotional support that they receive and the encouragement from many different positive comments and interactions that they have in these fan fiction communities. So the reason why I wanted to share this in this particular context of gaming is because first of all, I think that we can find distributed mentoring in many different online communities. And what happens and what the benefits of distributed mentoring for young people, I mean, there's lots, but I think they kind of boil down to these three. First is each young person experiences agency. So they're not only getting feedback, but they're also able to give feedback. So maybe they're struggling with the development of a character, but they're really good at plot. So they might get some advice around character development. They might give some advice around plot. So they're contributing their expertise when and where they can. They're experiencing the power of community and what it's like to be part of something larger than themselves. And they're also learning a lot from each other in an interest-driven, participatory way. And so we developed the concept of distributed mentoring in the context of our fan fiction research, but we believe it can be used to describe the processes involved in mentoring and learning in other online affinity spaces. And I really think it translates very easily to online game contexts where players come together, usually around a shared interest and goal. They develop expertise through participating and playing alongside other players, and they share their own expertise with the community as it develops. And all this is happening and being supported by the affordances of network technologies. So I think what the concept of distributed mentoring can do is really help to provide a roadmap for the intentional design and creation of online gaming environments that effectively support young people's agency, their experience of community, and the learning that they get out of their participation. So I will stop there and pass it back to you, Katie.
Great, thanks, Katie. Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, we had a workshop that Katie, you were at, and Kishonna and Lynn also in February around raising good gamers. And a lot of the game companies were talking just about the real challenges around just moderation. And there was actually a really deep interest in beginning to think about intentionally designing for structures of peer mentorship, right, within these communities. You know, you see it happening at the player level, particularly within kind of sandbox style games where players might be building things or, you know, kind of producing things, role playing. But there was even this sort of thinking about that it might help solve the moderation problem, to kind of reimagine what moderation might look like, to say moderation actually could become mentorship. And I think about the sort of learning from places like fan fiction communities where there are really robust infrastructures for that kind of mentorship, kids developing kind of leadership capacities, right, developing roles, you know, within the community. So yeah, your work is really relevant. And also just personally, your guys' book, The Secret Garden, is like, for my lab, is just like a central touchstone text. Because we do a lot of work around mentorship, and certainly this model of distributive mentoring is just so critical, I think, as we begin to imagine how to support young people, because the mentorship piece provides them, as you said, so much, right? It is the scaffolding towards becoming like civically engaged, healthy online participants.
Absolutely, it really, and one thing we found in our analysis of the reviews, the story reviews, was just how a very tiny fraction of them could be considered flames. And when we look deeper, it's because anytime there's a flame that comes about, the rest of the community comes to the defense of the victim of that flame. And sure, there's moderators and all that, but everyone is so invested. And so even the moderation is kind of distributed, and it's really, at least, of course, there are fan sites that are less positive, but in the ones that we studied, it worked really well, and it was very heartening.
Awesome. Okay, so we're gonna move to Lynn. So I'm gonna drive your slides, Lynn. So you just let me know when you want me to advance.
Sure.
Thank you. So thank you, Katie and Susanna, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be a continued part of this conversation around raising good gamers. So quick introduction, my name is Lynn Fiellin. I'm a professor of medicine and the Child Study Center at the Yale School of Medicine, and I'm the founding director of the Play to Prevent Lab at the Yale Center for Health and Learning Games. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what we do in my lab regarding our approach to creating positive and inclusive game communities for youth. And part of the way we do that is really having our games built by youth for youth. And that is a continued theme. So I have to say, you know, I've been taking notes on everything that you guys have been talking about. And Katie Davis, what you just talked about in terms of agency, experience of community and learning is exactly what this presentation is about. Like, it just syncs up perfectly in terms of what part of our major focus is when we develop our games. So next slide, please. So as I said, we are the Play to Prevent Lab at the Yale Center for Health and Learning Games. And what we do is develop, evaluate, and implement video games that impact health, behavior, social intelligence, and education in youth and young adults. Next slide. And this is what we've come to call our Playport prevention platform. We've been doing this work now for just celebrated our 10-year anniversary, and we're working on our 4th NIH-funded video game intervention. You know, the outcomes, I'm a medical doctor, so the outcomes we focus on are typically health-related outcomes, but the way we get there is through different sort of, you know, areas of focus of behavioral science, social emotional learning, character development. And so while we focus on, you know, developing something that is effective, we ultimately, the process is really critical in terms of our engagement with the youth that we work with. Next, please. So as with any good intervention development, we start with a conceptual model, sort of designing what our endpoint, usually again, a health-related outcome, and then backing into that, looking at what we need to impact along the way to get to the outcome in our target audience. Next, please. And building on that conceptual model, we create behavior change manuals, which we've now come to call our game playbooks, which tend to be very involved, very lengthy documents that outline what our player transformation goals are, what the theoretical constructs are that we plan to use, kind of what the mechanics are. So they're really working, living documents between our team and the game development team, so that ultimately we end up with something that accomplishes what we set out to have it accomplish and is based on evidence and theory, hopefully leading that to be effective with our target audience. Next, please. But having said all that, I mean, that is a critical part of the work we do, but the other critical part, or even more critical part, is the formative work that we do with youth. Over the past 10 years, we have worked with hundreds and hundreds of kids in the greater New Haven area, and now expanding out more statewide and nationally. And these kids play a role in every part of our process, and very importantly, the development process. And I think that's where we sort of speak to that area of creating, you know, positive and inclusive gaming experiences for kids, because we really turn to the kids to help guide us in the process of our development. Next slide. So part of that development process, and I'll talk through this process, we began this with our first game, which was called Play Forward Elm City Stories, which focused on risk reduction and HIV prevention in a younger, mostly racial and ethnic minority population of kids in inner city New Haven. And we've carried through with this process with all of our subsequent games, but we do a lot of focus groups, we do a lot of discussions, a lot of interviews with kids. But if anyone knows teenagers, it's really hard to get them to talk about stuff, right? You can't just, I mean, I raised teenagers and you'd say, how was your day? And they'd be like, good, what'd you do? Nothing. So when we get these kids together, we really need them to talk and share in a way that feels safe, but allows them to really help us better understand their world so that those things can be built into our games. So this was a method we used, which I loved, and we've used since, is that we actually had this graphic produced specifically for our focus group because we wanted something that represented teens in a situation that wasn't overtly risky. Remember, this game was focused on risk reduction and HIV prevention in a younger adolescent group. And so, so what we did is we had a focus group of about 12, 15 kids. We sat down with them, we handed them this picture, and all we said is, what do you think's going on here? And the stories that came out of that discussion were just fascinating. Case in point, if you look all the way back to the middle there, there's a little girl who's looking down. So 85% of the girls in our focus group said she had just found out she was pregnant, which was really pretty startling and really sort of betrayed what was going on around them in their communities and their lives and their families, things that they were experiencing. And so all of these stories that came from the kids in these very rich discussions were all built into the stories of our game. So it was really, again, their stories, their voices that built our games. Next, please. So similarly, we needed to figure out how we could get artwork that felt like it was authentic and real and meaningful. And so we gave a group of about 12 kids disposable cameras. And we said, take your cameras, go out into your community and take pictures of everything that is of interest to you, that you see every day, that's important. And they did, and they brought back their cameras, and we developed those pictures and talked with them a little bit about them, and then shipped all of those photos, images down to Shell Games, who is our game development partner. And all of those photos, or a lot of them, then were translated specifically into the artwork of the game. So instead of asking kids, what does your bedroom look like? What does your neighborhood look like? What do your friends look like? We actually just had their eyes do the work, and they took it on, and they helped us translate what was their real life into the game. Next, please. And again, all of this back and forth, highly iterative process, bringing everything to them, saying, is this what people look like? Is this what settings look like? Is this what your school looks like? Is this what your house looks like? And kids also are pretty willing to tell you, if asked directly, exactly what they think. And so they were able to completely guide and steer what went into this game and what goes into our games from their perspective, from what's real to them, authentic to them, again, with the goal that ultimately it will have impact on them. And if it's not real or meaningful or authentic, the chance that it's going to have impact on them, from my perspective, is a lot less. Next, please. So again, just iterative in terms of getting it from the beginning to the end, and at each of these stages going back and forth to the kids, to the game developers, to the kids. But the kids really, I mean, it's like a triangle. It's the scientists, it's the game developers, it's the kids. They play a fundamental role, again, so that what we create is something that they own. Next, please. So with this first game, this is where we landed with Playport Elm City Stories, which was developed and ended up being about 16 hours of unique gameplay on the iPad. And we have completed now, a couple of years ago, a full-scale randomized control trial, including follow-up data at 2 years with a group of over 330 young teens. Next, please.
Okay, can you wrap up in about 2 minutes?
Okay. Sure. This is just the home screen. You can see the player creates their own avatar and is able to actually give it personal attributes and sort of aspirational elements such that it makes their character more meaningful to them. Next, please. And again, while the goal is to part of the goal is to really demonstrate some efficacy in terms of accomplishing what we hope to, and we've published on this. Next, please. As important is to find out from the youth how we did in terms of their player experience. Again, we design and develop these games with them taking the lead, but then we have to really make sure that we've accomplished that. So you can see here, we actually do qualitative interviews with each of our players at the end of the play period. And you can see, just as a sample, that up to 80% enjoyed playing the game, thought it was challenging, felt responsible for the choices they made in the game. And then importantly, majority felt that they would make decisions in real life as they had in the game. Next, please. We saw some interesting gender differences. Again, if we're thinking about how to build these games as sort of tailored or as specific to youth and what is important to them. Girls reported more likely to play the game again and that they liked the game. Interestingly, boys reported feeling more connected with their character in the game, which sort of surprised me, I guess. And that they felt more frustrated with the game. So that was sort of something important for us to take into account. Next, please. So again, we collect qualitative data and really end up also just sort of, asking kids free form what their thoughts were. So these are just a few snippets. One, a 13-year-old girl said, when you're playing a game, you're learning something, actually learning something because you get to read it, because when I read something, I remember it. So it's better for me to play it, read it, and download it in my head. Another girl at 14 said, because you're not just talking about it, you actually see the consequences. It takes you and you really see the effects of it. To just talk about it and saying it's going to happen, but not seeing the reactions of it. And finally, a boy 13 said, I liked the personal section where you had to design what you liked about yourself. Next, please. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I mean, I feel like your work has so much to contribute methodologically, right? So at least for raising good gamers, we just want to privilege youth voice, right? So this idea that methodologically one would include them in all stages of the process, I think is really amazing. And did you do any research to see what the impact of just participating in the design process might have had on the kids in terms of outcomes?
Yeah, not officially. We always, at different times we've heard about, New Haven's a fairly small community. So, people on my team will run into students in the, movie theater, or back in the day when we went to movies. But, and they would say things like, oh, gosh, I had an experience the other day that was just like, the one, by the pool in the game, and so there was a sense that they sort of they did own part. They felt it was their game, their stories. But that's an interesting part of it, and maybe something we should seriously think about with the game that we're developing now is taking that approach.
Yeah, it's just always, we do some work not exactly alike, but in terms of engaging kids, and we're always seeing that they're just the fact that they're acknowledged as an expert, right, has a kind of outcome for them. They also build community, right? There's mentoring that happens with the undergrads, and so there's, in a way, there's other kinds of outcomes, maybe not around the content of the game, but it's a kind of caring, you're building a kind of community of care for them in a way around, and you just happen to be making a game together. But so, yeah, it would be interesting to kind of look at that and study that. Yeah,
absolutely.
All right, so last but not least, Celia, do you want to spend a little time talking about, I mean, you had sort of said, just as we were waiting in the green room, like, I'm not a researcher, but you actually are a researcher. You're not an academic researcher, right? But you're a UX researcher. You have, obviously worked on some of the most famous and amazing game titles that lots of young people are playing. So yeah, we just would love your perspective. You also run a really amazing organization called Ethical Games, and you've been doing a lot of work thinking about the ethics of design, a lot of work around cognitive bias, implicit bias, those kinds of things, which all feed into the kinds of things we're talking about in terms of how might we think about the design of these environments for young people. So you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, and thank you so much for having me here. I do feel like an intruder because I don't do research anymore, but I do come from academic background. I have a PhD in psychology, and I'm specialized in child development. So my PhD was on child development and how children learn about numbers. And so I started my career with that in mind, how we can make games to be more educational, and how we can really use that power of games, if they do have that power to engage, because not all games are engaging, to help kids, learn more efficiently. So it's more around the constructionist approach led by Seymour Papert. who is a disciple from of Jean Piaget. So it's all about, if children participate into constructing their knowledge, then they're going to learn better, and what they've learned in one situation is going to transfer better to another situation, which is the whole difficulty of education, is making sure not only they learn something in an environment, that the kids are able to transfer it in another situation. So I've always been interested in all these questions and about your work, Katie, like at the Institute of Play. And so all the things that have been talked about so far in this panel is really interesting to me, because now I'm on the other side. I'm more on the side of the publisher. So it's been over 10 years now that I've been working in the video game industry. So I worked at Ubisoft, initially at the Games for Everyone initiative, which was to bring something more than just entertainment. So they had a lot of games on DS, such as My Word Coach or My ACT Coach. So these questions were really important to me. But then I moved more into just games for entertaining people. So Ubisoft in Montreal, then LucasArts, and finally at Epic, where I worked until October 2017. So all these questions are really interesting, and there's as everyone was talking, I thought of different elements, like when Kishonna was talking about the how we don't necessarily understand what it's like for the kids, what's their environment. It's really funny to me, because you were mentioning cognitive bias, Katie. A lot of game developers don't necessarily realize that kids don't play in front of a massive TV and have their super high Wi-Fi, and so it's always interesting to remind people, like, hey, not everybody is playing games as you are playing in your living room, because I've worked in a lot of AAA studios, and they have this vision that people can play in front of a massive screen. And so when we say, hey, maybe your UI is a bit small, can we just work on this UI to make it more inclusive, or make sure that you have an option to make it bigger so it can be more inclusive? And people, what do you mean it's small? I make on my massive screen, it's not that small. Well, it turns out that most people don't have the massive screen that you have. So you need to realize what it's like for most people and teenagers. They often play at school, at universities, and there's a lot of people like walking around, and they're in small rooms that they share. So it's not the same situation as a grown-up developer who has, again, massive TV screen on their living room. And yeah, and it's also, I was also interested into like all the concept around like Katie Davis was talking about, distributing mentoring and how we can use the games as a space to foster that. And that's, to me, it's particularly interesting since games are becoming more than just games, and they're like, we see that with Fortnite very well. Fortnite is more than just a game. It's a social space where the teenagers and adults alike, they share experiences there, and they just hang out, and they watch a concert, they even watch a movie. And so it's interesting to try to understand how these games are gonna foster this kind of new exchanges and sharing experiences among players, and how we can ensure that the environment makes it inclusive to share and in a safe space. And so that's also what I was interested into Lynn's work, because I understand how behavioral science, how it's important to understand as you create a space where players are gonna have certain things that they can do and certain things that they cannot do, and this is by design. And it's important to understand how this is gonna influence players to interact with the system. So I often take the example from Genova Chen when he's explaining how he iterated on the game journey, because he wanted that game to be a sharing experience, a collaborative experience with someone you cannot talk to. And so how to go beyond not being able to talk to someone to collaborate with that person. And he had to do a lot of iteration on that because initially there were collision between the characters and journey, and characters could die. And when he was doing playtests initially, he saw that instead of helping each other out, like for example, climbing a mountain, you know, they go back to back and you help each other out to climb. He saw a lot of people that were just pushing someone off a cliff, and that person was dying in a pool of blood, and he was really desperate. It was like, why are people so mean? But then he realized that his system was actually rewarding that sort of behavior in the game. And when you play a game, you know, it's make believe. So what you think is just experimenting with the environment can be felt as toxic on the person on this receiver end. But, you know, a lot of toxic behavior, antisocial behavior happen just because people are maybe annoyed that day, or they just want to try out and experiment with the environment. And so it's really important to understand how the environment that we create, what sort of behavior they facilitate and what sort of behavior they prevent. And at the end, Genova removed the collisions, and so now you can't push the other. And he found a way to, if people are close to one another, they're going to fly longer. So now there's no punishment, I mean, there's no reward in being antisocial with someone, and you are rewarded being next to someone. So all these questions are really interesting to me, and how we can think of games as a system that are facilitating, influencing the behaviors of the players in the system. And for children, it's tremendously important because this is also shaping their future, and they're learning how to interact through games a lot now. So it's important to help them grow and understand what's important to know about online spaces, and what's, you know, how to protect themselves, but also how they can foster a good exchanges, and how they can share things in a very inclusive way. So this is all these elements that I'm interested in, and I don't have any research to bring to the table to help with that. But what I love to do is bridging the industry with academia, so we can together think about how to create a more inclusive spaces for children and adults alike.
Yeah, so no, it's so great, Celia. I mean, one of the things that is really clear is that there isn't good infrastructure to bridge industry and research, academia and industry. And in fact, both groups really want to communicate with each other, and both groups have something to say to each other, but there actually aren't that many mechanisms beyond people like yourself who are really great translators. Right. So part of, I think, what we're trying to look at is how we might encourage some stronger research practice partnerships, right, where we might begin to look at what are the ways in which we might begin to do this kind of bridging and translation work, which is just really critical. I mean, I remember I was working on a project to kind of document development processes of different developers, and was talking to the folks from Media Molecule about Little Big Planet, and talking to their community managers. And I remember the person I was talking to said, well, we would never want to reward behavior that we don't want to see. So they had decided within their community that you couldn't thumbs down something, because they're like, why would we reward that behavior? If you don't like it, don't play the level, right? So it was this like real awareness around that very, very simple design choices, right? Embed behaviors, embed dynamics, embed narratives, right, around what is acceptable, what are the values of that space, those kinds of things. So I'm really interested in the work around game mechanics and just the systems design, even the kind of underlying biases of the technology in terms of what they're, as you said, what are they allowing or not allowing, right? And how that actually is a lever for change as we move forward to begin to think about how do we develop, environments that, lean towards the pro-social in certain ways. So, okay.
Yeah,
so
design and, design and technology can never be neutral. So sometimes, developers are like, oh yeah, but if they do that in the game, it's their choice. But okay, but you allow this choice happening, and you reward this choice, and you might not even reward the opposite choice in terms of morality. So it's really important to understand that these moral values and the system we're creating. Yeah, and I'm really happy. I'm looking forward to seeing what Raising Good Gamers are gonna cluster. It's super exciting, and I'm really honored to take part in the conversation.
Yeah, no, we're so happy to have everybody. And there was a funny comment when we launched it. I think JB Brown tweeted about that we're assembling the Avengers of pro-social gaming. It is sort of true. It's like all of you guys are so, so amazing with so many very specific skills, and it only works together, right, when we bring it together. Okay, so I think Marissa said we're moving to the Q&A portion. And so what we decided we'd do is, if you guys have questions, just put them in chat, and I'm gonna try to sort of curate them a little bit, just in terms of making sure I can spread the questions around to our different panelists, and make sure that we're not being redundant. So let's see if anyone has a question. I see lots of like yays happening, so that's good. Oh, someone did say, Celia, that you are a researcher. Thank you for the great presentation.
I used to be, I'm not anymore. That's
Okay, any questions? All right, well, maybe while people are thinking, do you guys have questions for each other? Anything you might like to ask each other?
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. This was fantastic. This was so amazing. I'm so glad to be in conversation and to, have our work, speaking across and among and with each other, right? I was really just fascinated, with the work that I saw, like a lot of connections, especially like with what Lynn was doing, and, especially like getting like the youth involved. I know we had like that conversation in the chat, but maybe if you want to like speak like a little bit more, because I think that's something like to highlight about how we, we bring these young folks into like the process of like doing this work, and like, are we, and I like to think that like I'm dismantling power hierarchies and reshifting and distributing like resources, like, and making like the youth have like a say like in a lot of that stuff. Have you seen like because this is a lot of my work, I haven't seen like that long-term like effect yet, because this is like a new project. So Lynn, like, is there, because I know you say you were tracking like a lot of the folks and looking like long-term, have you seen like any like differences like from like the traditional work that you've done about how like this is like actually like impacting these youth? Are they going into like STEM fields or STEM careers? Are they are they making like those kinds of like is that happening like for these youth?
Yeah, so I think, it's, and so that's kind of to Katie's question about, sort of how that their involvement in that process could have impact in and of itself. And it's, it's interesting because it makes me think that we might have an opportunity for the 300 plus kids that we enrolled in that original study to go back to them and actually collect some data. My team would probably kill me because it was so hard to get 2-year follow-up on them, but just to get a sense of sort of what that role may have played in their life for certain choices. And because we know that it's like you're a teenager and you have a really meaningful experience at a job, and that can really change the way you think about things and the choices you make. So I don't have an answer for your question, but it makes me think that maybe it's something that we could go back and look at, because I think, their input is invaluable, right? As a bunch of like middle-aged, adults, we can't even claim to sort of say what they're thinking or feeling or what their experiences are firsthand. So they are the narrators, as you said, in your chat. But it'd be interesting to see how that role actually impacted on them.
Okay, so I'm gonna take a question from chat. People have had a little bit of chance to think. So there's a question about parents. So what part might parents have to play in raising good gamers, and how can we support parents? Anyone want to?
Maybe I can take this one, because I talk a lot to parents. Sometimes parents are pissed off at even though I did not work on Battle Royale, but anyway, I'm still responsible for the kids playing too long. So it's a very difficult conversation to have, because a lot of parents don't necessarily understand video games or play video games themselves. I actually talk a lot to game developers who are parents themselves, and I ask them, how does that work at your place? And they seem to have rules that are much more established. And the problems with parents is going to be it's hard for them to take on this role to help children when they are not necessarily tech savvy or video game savvy themselves. And so that's because it's actually hard to navigate. I mean, the technology is moving super fast, so you don't necessarily understand. A lot of parents are not aware of the ESRB rating system. They don't necessarily understand that Fortnite had different modes. And so when I ask them, what mode is your child playing? And they're like, I don't know. Well, I mean, if they're playing Save the World or they're playing Battle Royale, they're playing the creative mode, it's going to be a very different experience. And so I think it's important. I mean, from the industry side, it's going to be important to give parents tools to understand video games better, and so they can help putting frames and help their children navigate this online world that they don't even know themselves. So I think that's the difficult part for parents.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. So I think the issue of, so on the one hand, there's a lot of recommendations that parents should be co-playing with their kids. And even if they can't co-play, that they should find a way to connect around the interest, right? So that's the main thing. It's like, if you can connect with your kids' interests, that's where great supports happen with the young people. But a lot of the tools assume that parents are either very tech savvy, right? Even know where to look in a game to find the parental controls, right? It's actually not consistent, right, across games. And it's a lot of the material is written at it assumes English, like actually a pretty high level of English for a lot of parents. So there's actually a huge equity issue around assumptions that a lot of these games, and not just games, but sort of media have around parents, right? That they are able to, that they're digitally savvy, that they have a kind of literacy, even a game or media literacy to understand these kinds of choices, or even the time, right? This is the other thing, that it assumes an enormous amount of time on the part of the parent to kind of vet games, to set up the controls, to kind of talk to their children, all of these kinds of things. So I think what we're finding is that there really needs to be a new kind of set of intermediaries, right? So in a way, it's partially the developer's responsibility, but we need some intermediaries that help that kind of brokering with parents, right? And really figures out, how do we make this information accessible and actually usable for parents? Because right now it's in a way quite elitist. It assumes a lot about what parents, can do. So it's a huge issue, but we also know that when parents are able to connect with their kids around a gaming interest, that it can be super transformative to them. So moving beyond just like surveilling their activity or kind of controlling time on screen, right? How do we shift the conversation towards understanding what kind of quality play might be in these kinds of games, and how those conversations with their kids can happen? I don't know if anybody has. I have, Katie and I both have sort of little kids, and so I think we haven't gotten to the stage yet where we're having to sort of deal with these questions, but I think about it a lot. I don't know, Katie, what your experience is.
But also I also think as a parent, there's such a strong message to do co-view and joint media engagement with your kids. And it's just, you can't do that all the time, especially right now when I'm with my kid all the time. Mm-hmm. I need to do the dishes, or I need to have a shower, or I need to do some work. And I can't watch everything that he's doing or do everything. It's just not realistic. So I think, you have to be a little bit more gentle on yourself, I think, as a parent sometimes. And the other thing I think of also is I started off my professional career as an elementary school teacher. And I know that if you're in a position of authority, it can feel intimidating to give that authority to kids and say, you're the expert, you teach me how to do it, because I don't have the expertise. And when for the first year of teaching, I didn't feel comfortable doing that. But once I started to get the hang of it, I let the kids take over a little bit more. And that's when some really great things can happen, and when they can start teaching you. And I think the same goes for parenting as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to Laura Higgins from Roblox did a panel, like a fireside chat a couple days ago around a new survey that they put out around teens and Roblox. They did a survey of their global kind of Twitter users, teens, and they had some really interesting findings and stories telling about like during COVID, part of what has happened is parents just simply have more insight into what their kids are doing online because they're sitting right next to them for hours at a time, right?
Yeah.
Which before didn't happen. It was sort of like maybe right before dinner they were home and they were, but now they're like co-working in a way together. And the report has some really interesting stories about kind of parents for the first time, simply because they've had time to observe and talk to their kids about what they're doing. Like the parents say, wow, that like for a game the child built in Roblox, or the teen, like, wow, you worked really hard on that. Like that was a lot of work, right? Where before that they would have said, oh, you were just kind of playing a game. So that report's really, really great. And I do think that the pandemic has brought about a new recognition of the kind of role kids' participation in online communities have, right? Which is they need some independence, right? Simply because the parent has to work, right? And that if we can enable that independence, right, there's good things that can happen for the kids, but at the same time, we really have to think about the environments in terms of what kind of potential opportunities and risks, right, might be to some more independent play for the kids. Okay, let's do, which report is that? So if you Google Roblox teen COVID report, you'll be able to find it. And also, if you look at the Games for Change for this session with Laura Higgins, I'm sure that there is a link for that. So someone asked that question. Okay, let's see.
So, Katie, I would just really say, I'd echo what Ellis wrote, which is farther up in the chat, where he said, continue asking your child to explain why the game is fun and they love to talk about it. So having raised 3 teenagers, all who were big gamers, and full disclosure, I am not a gamer. So I would do just that. I would just sit next to them, right? And it would, I mean, again, like Katie pointed out, the other Katie, that you got to go do other stuff in life. But for those times, I would try to take some opportunity to sit with them. But I knew it was always a struggle to figure out how to sort of mediate that relationship. It's tough for parents.
Yeah, but it's also, I think the first step is just when you are willing to have a conversation, or it's like you legitimize the interest, right? You sponsor that interest. You say, okay, you're interested in that. Tell me about it. I want to know about it. Maybe I don't get it, like, because I'm already an adult and you think I'm stupid and whatever, but tell me about it, right? And maybe I can help support this interest. Like, how else can I support you? Oh, you want to get on that server? Well, let's figure out how to do it together. Maybe. So that is, I think, super important. The kind of sponsorship of the interest, the kind of brokering of opportunity for those kids. So you don't have to be an expert and you don't have to actually be in the game. There's lots of other ways that you can do that support, which is kind of about connecting, legitimizing, that kind of thing. Okay, are we out of time? We might be out of time. Marissa, are we out of time? Okay, I'm going to let us go because I don't want to get into ways of other people's session. But ladies, it was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great. A lot of fun.
So looking forward to this. Yeah, it was really great.
This was great.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
It was a great conversation.
And thanks, everyone, for the great questions. And we will talk to you later. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.